pine cone from a ponderosa pine specifically. Very interesting structure. Maybe you've seen them in Anunnaki or ancient Sumerian depictions. Um, Not all cones are pine cones. Of course, pine cones come from pine trees. Fir cones come from fir trees. But the pine and the pine cone is such an ancient symbol that most people just call every kind of cone a pine cone. Pine cones are very interesting. Their geometry is interesting. Their structure, how they operate, both on the tree and when they're on the ground. I think a lot of people think of pine cones as kind of a masculine symbol, but a pine cone, this kind of pine cone, is actually would be considered like the female. This is a womb. This holds the seeds. It's much larger than the male cone, the pollen cones, which are like this. They're small. I know you're laughing now. Much larger, of course. The female needing to hold seeds and nurture those seeds. So it's a feminine principle. It's interesting. It does have some little thorns you can see on there. Now this is all open. It's dry. It's a dry day out. So when it's dry out, pine cones will open up to allow their seeds to fall out. Also to allow them to be pollinated. When it's raining, this will close up, and in a lot of those old depictions, you'll never see an open pine cone. You'll always see a closed pine cone. When this pine cone is closed, you could probably run this underwater for like 20 minutes and it'll close. Even though it's not on the tree anymore, you could consider it perhaps dead, but it is actually still operating because of the things that it's made out of, its structure, the way it's built, designed, developed, however you want to think of that. Whether the structure of a pine cone is just something that's an adaptation, a development through evolution over millions of years, or if there's some grand architect behind the design of something like this, it's up to you. But it is what it is. It's the way it is. You will notice on the back, we've got kind of that spiraling representation of the Fibonacci sequence, which is inherent in everything. It's kind of one of the basic mathematical structures of the universe, and it's there and in many plants to see. The pine cone depicts that rather well. So that's an interesting thing about the pine cone, is that profession of the Fibonacci sequence. Pine cones are interesting. They are actually built to, when they're open like this, to draw air in. So they're a very receptive principle. This is going to be maybe a feminine principle of receptivity, depends on how you look at that. The feminine and masculine, not man and woman, but that energy or those qualities. When air comes by a pine cone, it isn't aerodynamically pushed like you would see in when you're testing cars, aerodynamics or something, but it's actually pulled in to the pine cone. It's drawn in. Its structure, the way it is built, is attractive to that. It'll draw it in. It's attractive. It's an attractive principle. And that, of course, will draw in wind and air currents that may have pollen on them. So it's part of its fertility, its structure, fertility. The fertility principle is attractive in the pine cone. Of course, when it's wet, it will close, holding in the seeds, holding in the pollen it's gathered, so it won't get washed away. So that's kind of interesting. Also, when it is closed, these thorns will be presented, and this will be very prickly. If you to pick it up when it's closed, it's going to, you're going to feel those thorns. But when it's being receptive, these thorns are the bracts are open, the thorns are pointed down. Feels good to the touch. It's not pokey. It's kind of good to know when to be receptive, when to be thorny, when to be defensive. Not to judge anybody's decision on that. Obviously, it's up to the individual when that's appropriate. But of course, those are things to think about for the individual to contemplate. When to be defensive, when to be thorny, when to be pushing outwards, things like that. When to be resistant, and when not to. When is it good for you and your purpose? When is it beneficial or healthy to be receptive? When is it beneficial and healthy to be thorny? So there's some interesting things about the pine cone. I don't know, those old depictions, those Sumerian engravings, pointing to maybe the fundamental geometry underlying everything, mathematics, feminine and masculine principles, timeliness, when to be fertile, when not to be fertile, when to be receptive, when not to be receptive, when to reproduce, when not to reproduce. Those are interesting things to consider. It's beautiful. Have a good day. So I did find in this Douglas fir forest, where it's more cool and moist, there is one of the examples of a closed pine cone. So this is showing that more conical shape, which will allow it to roll around in tight circles. You can do it on your hand. You can see that it would move around in a little circle. Again, still presenting that Fibonacci sequence, and very triangular yet rounded, so that it can move tight circles. You will notice that now that it closes, those thorns are sticking directly out. They're presented outwards, very defensive. It's a very defensive situation. Of course, I'm handling this very lightly. As you all know, when something is being thorny, applying pressure is not a good idea. You're going to get hurt. Take some responsibility. It's your fault, probably. Applying force with something, a soft tissue, applying force to a thorny thing, right? So if you don't want to get hurt, you don't want your soft parts to get hurt, maybe don't apply pressure when things are thorny, or when someone's being thorny, prickly. Ow! Tried to catch it, hurt myself. Sometimes you gotta just drop it, let it fall. Try to catch it, try to stop its fall, you might get hurt too. Little takeaways. Again, very interesting part of that pine cone. Not the best example of a super conical shaped one, but most everything out here is open. In this area, there are some ponderosa pines trying to make a go at it, but they're not the best examples of these kind of things. So have a good day.